We'll have a talk, lecture, speech for approximately 45 minutes. And thereafter, the floor will be open for questions for the speaker. This week, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Camila Vergara. Camila Vergara is a Marie Skodowska-Curie Fellow at the University of Cambridge and author of a number of great articles and an excellent book by Princeton University Press entitled Systemic Corruption, Constitutional Ideas for an Anti-Oligarchic Republic. Today, she'll be talking on Plebeian Futures, Imagining Alternative Societies from Below. Welcome, Camilla.
Thank you. Ah, it's actually here. Okay, got it. Let me put my timer so I don't go over. Okay, so I need to be looking over there. Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for having me. Thank you to Lawrence Hamilton for inviting me, for planning this trip to come to South Africa. Such a beautiful country, and I see a lot of similarities with my native country, Chile. We are living in what I have called in a couple of articles a socioeconomic apartheid, in the sense that we have first and second class citizens de facto, even if we are all equal under the law. The law doesn't treat us equally. The majority of people have no property, need to pay for the majority of services, and therefore they can only afford a part of them. So basic needs, which are labeled as a human right, not only in these constitutions in South Africa and other places, but also in international law, are not really materialized. Human rights are only formal and are not really protected, not in South Africa and not elsewhere, especially in the global South. So in this talk, I want to spark your imagination a little bit and see how we can get out of this society in which there are first and second class citizens, and the law and the constitution do not help us to reach a more egalitarian and more socially just society. So the first question I think we need to think about is why we need to transform our current way of life, even if it sounds for the majority of you something that is obvious that we need to find another path, and not just reform what we have, just conserve the system that we have, and just kind of go around the margins and kind of try to make it better, make it more adaptable. And my short response here is because we are in societies that are systemically corrupt. This is a concept that I have put forth in my work, that corruption cannot be understood only as a problem of bad apples in government. Some individuals that accept bribes, right, that commit fraud, that use public money for their own enrichment. This is not something that can be resolved by plucking out the bad apples and just expect that the system works better now, right? Our systems of representative democracy have been built to not channel the voice of the people, but actually keep the people away from power by giving the power to political parties and political elites, even if government officials or partisans were not far away from the people at the beginning. For example, labor parties, in the short and medium term, they become more oligarchic, they become more like the elites that they are trying to fight. And they are part of the problem. And this is the problem of systemic corruption in our representative governments. And one of the issues here is that we believe that a free republic A free form of government is the one based on free and fair elections, in which we have the right to say whatever we want, right? We have freedom of speech, we have fair procedures, and therefore we consider our republic free. However, elections historically have not been a democratic mechanism, but actually an aristocratic method. We use elections as a way of selecting the best among us, not to just give the people a chance to actually be in power and exercise power. It's a way of really selecting among the elites that have been pre-selected by either parties or other groups of interest. So this representative government that was thought as a way of, as a free republic, really was from the very beginning by the elites that drew this, designed this representative governments. These governments were governments of elites that were going to be run by elites, only authorized by the people. So what we do when we go to the voting booth, we just give legitimacy to the people in power. We give our vote to a platform that is sold to us. We are not political agents in this system. We are political consumers. And this is something that we need to change if we are going to liberate ourselves from the tyranny of the market and political parties that have become corrupt. So the system of representative government everywhere has yielded a system in which the powerful few are benefited systematically and disproportionately. So in other words, the system itself allows for the rich to get richer and for the poor to perpetuate and be reproduced in poverty and precarity. There is, even if our representative governments are chosen by a majority, they don't really serve the majority. Laws are enforced always to favor the powerful few and to oppress or extract from the most vulnerable in society. And this is true in South Africa, where more than 85% of the wealth is owned by 10% of the country. So the richest 10% in South Africa own more than 85% of the wealth. This is astonishing. At the global level, two-thirds, almost 70% of the wealth is owned by the 10 richest percent of the population. And this is repeated elsewhere. And we have naturalized this form of government that allows for these inequalities and deepens this inequality. We have lived 4 years of neoliberal policies everywhere in the world, which have been privatizing social services and allowing for the rich to pay less and less taxes. We need to remind ourselves that after World War II, the majority of European countries and also the US had the tax rates were between 80 and 90% for the people in the upper bracket. This has gone down from almost 40% to 20-something% if you are corporate and you can evade taxes in that manner. So we are in a society that is way more unequal than 40 years ago. And this inequality cannot even be measured correctly because we have tax havens where the super rich get their money and store them away from the purview of the state. And we don't really know how much money has been gone out and how much money is stored away. So our measurement of inequality is with the, the numbers that are out there, not the secret numbers, and it's just a guesstimation of how much money is actually stored elsewhere. So inequality is a more serious problem that we actually account for it. So we have been living in this neoliberal system in which competitive individualism has been the founding principle here. And this is astonishing. In the UK, where I'm residing now, 17 people, individual people, of course, they're all men, individual people, but this is about individual competitive individualism. 17 people own more wealth than the lower 50% of the population. 17 people, and 1 in 3 children lives in poverty and is in food insecurity. This is one of the richest countries on earth. The global south, of course, we know is much worse in the numbers. So what is systemic corruption? If we think about the individual corruption as the appropriation of wealth illegally, right, by government officials, we really are pegging corruption to the law. Whatever is legal is not corrupt. We have been legalizing corruption for years. An example, campaign finance at the beginning of the 20th century in the majority of countries around the world was illegal. Giving money to candidates was always an illegal action because there's supposedly you ask for something in return, or you will ask for something in return when that person is actually in office. The same happened with lobbyists. Before the 1990s, lobbyism, the idea of having a group of people that have special access to representatives in power, is something that was, of course, illegal before. We pay a middleman, right, to go and talk to our representative. So the representative puts a law out that benefits us, right, our group. This was illegal before. Now it's completely legal, and there are lists of lobbyists, and we have cleaned it up, basically. We have put it in the open. There's transparency in this. Our focus as a society has been in putting transparency first. We need to know who is paying who, however, we don't know really for what, and we cannot really stop it, right? So we have legalized lobbyism, lobbyists as a way of making our system more sanitary, if you will. However, when we talk about systemic corruption, we're talking about the corruption of the system. Supposedly, democracy should benefit the majority. It doesn't. It structurally benefits more the powerful few. So I have argued that we need to stop calling democracies, our system, as democracy full stop. There are other people that call it constitutional democracy, liberal democracy. I prefer the compound concept of oligarchic democracy, a system in which the majority authorizes, elects a few that are powerful, and those few do not govern for the good of the majority or the common good. Let's put, we don't know what the common good is, let's put for the benefit of the majority, but keep, they're the guardians of the system, basically. They keep reproducing this system that has allowed for the richest 10% to be super wealthy and to keep enriching themselves legally, not illegally. So we have to detach corruption from the law and call things that are supposedly in benefit of the common good but are not as corrupt, because our system as a democracy, at least in principle, is supposed to serve the majority. So if we're not serving the majority but serving the few, we need to call it oligarchic. Oligo being the few, and archy being power and control. So, as I said before, elections that are for us the marker of a free republic were not a mechanism that was democratic at its origins, and it has been understood as a pacific, as a peaceful way of transferring power from one set of elites to another. But it's not really the people in government. It's not the government by the many for the many. It's the government of the few, by the few, and for the few, right? So we need a new way, in a way, to think about democracy and think about the way to organize ourselves politically. Elections were not a way to channel people's will, voluntas, but to keep them away from power, to allow the ruling elite to be authorized and rule in peace, in a way, without the people meddling, and have them only agitating in the streets and pushing from outside. And this systemic corruption is not only the oligarchization of power, the concentration of power in few hands, legally speaking, but also a moral corruption. If we think about our societies and what we think is good in our societies, we cannot but understand that these virtues that we elevate today as virtues are really vices. Think about, for example, extravagance and luxury, wastefulness, the single serving, straw, if you think about it like a metaphor, the idea, the single serving thing that you just use once and then discard because you can. All this videos and pop culture about becoming a billionaire, not a millionaire anymore, a billionaire, and becoming famous, right? Spending until you drop, being wasteful and just don't thinking about where all these resources come from. This was a vice from the very beginning in the history of humanity. It has never, ever been a virtue. It has always been a vice. But today, if someone makes a lot of money and wins the lottery, or just, has a successful business that went from one day to the next, they make millions of dollars, then we say, oh, this
Yeah, your sandwich is in the bag there.
this is not the case.
Yeah.
We have understood that
Take it out, take it out
extravagance
for you.
and luxury have
This is nice. You wanna
just
share this?
to the crisis of overproduction and overconsumption today. We are in the brink of extinction as a humanity because we have exhausted the resources and we have been burning fossil fuels, and we are almost at the turning point of the extinction that in our history maybe is not a new one. Some of the things that I have learned in visiting different cultures is that there are myths of deluge and of the flooding of the earth before. This has happened before to our humanity. We have done this before to ourselves. So we have done, this going into the end of the line in terms of our resources. And of course, who is benefiting from this? Who is benefiting from overconsumption and overproduction is really the elites. Today, the transnational oligarchy. And this is not something that needs to be emulated, but it needs to be reversed. So luxury has been the enemy of free government from the very beginning of Republican thought. For Machiavelli, for example, lords, and I quote here directly from the discourses, lords that live in luxury out of their free rents from their castles are the most dangerous groups for a free republic. They are the source of all misery and all corruption. If you have people that do not work for a living, and they just extract rents from the people, these are people that have no attachment to a specific republic, and they will do whatever they can to protect their privileges. And according to Machiavelli, this protection of their privileges leads them to acquire more, because the only way to be secure is to enlarge your state. So therefore, a free republic in which there is relative equality becomes very rapidly a monarchy or an oligarchy in which the few command the amounts of wealth. And it's not only plebeian thinkers like Machiavelli who argued that luxury was a problem from free government. We have the Baron de Montesquieu, this very aristocratic man from France that went to England to study free government. And for him, luxury is the enemy of any democratic republic. For him, we need to really put limits to luxury, because luxury goes against what he calls the principles of a democratic republic. First, the love of equality and the love of frugality. So for him, the only way that you can have a democratic republic that is free is one that is based not on luxury, not on producing more and acquiring more all the time and risk-taking, but actually in loving equality and only engage in frugality in your life, right? That you, and today we would call it sustainable development, right? That you actually can sustain yourself without exhausting the resources. And the problem is that Montesquieu, being an aristocrat and then being not a particularly pro-democracy thinker, he thought that the democratic republic was not suitable for these ages. He thought that the commercial republic was the republic that we should embrace as moderns. And this commercial republic, however, runs into an issue that when you have secure laws of investment, you have the rule of law, right? You have a government and laws, and you know the laws, then your investment is secure. So when you are securing your investment, what do you do to gain more? You take a risk. And this risk-taking allows for more inequality within the republic, because if you win your bet, you have way more wealth. But if you lost your bet, you go into poverty. So therefore, inequality is a process, natural almost, to the commercial republic that is secure in its rule of law. So the more secure we are, and we can think about our own republics engaging in trade agreements with other republics, so the transnational corporations of the US can safely invest in the South, in the global South, without taking the risk of being expropriated, for example, or the changing of the rules that will dampen their profits, because trade agreements will allow for more stability, something that elitist Republicans, the thinkers that wanted to give the government to the few because they're better, right? They can run things better. These people thought that with more stability, it will all actually inequality will grow. This was a standard reading. And this would put the commercial republic at risk of becoming a commercial oligarchy. So one of the things that is attached to this idea of luxury that we need to refrain, luxury is an enemy of liberty, is debt. The early Republican thinkers, such as Machiavelli and Jefferson, for example, Thomas Jefferson in the US, thought about debt as equal to slavery. Debt allows us to live beyond our means, right? Because we borrow money, but immediately make us dependent on the powerful few that lend us that money. So therefore, Republican thinkers who were very zealous of their liberty, as Republican liberty, liberty that is lived in equality, they thought about the debt as being a way to re-enslave the people by other means. So Machiavelli, who was a secretary in Florence of the Renaissance, in Florence, in the Republic of Florence, he thought that he was tasked with defending the Republic in war. And the problem with the Republic, it was a plebeian republic. The people governed themselves. The oligarchs were only, put they could only operate freely in their commercial space, not in government. They were ousted from actual power. They were having power anyway through the paying of mercenary armies. So Florence didn't have a standing army. They had to hire hands, in a way, hire mercenaries in order to defend themselves and wage war. So the same as happens today, that in military-industrial complex, they want war because it's a way of getting republics into debt with bankers and other, groups that do not have formal power, a political power. So Florence, even though it was a popular republic in which the people governed themselves in a way through their institutions, they were dependent on oligarchs who gave money to buy, mercenary armies in order to protect the republic. So Machiavelli says the only way to sever this is to stop having debt, being in debt with the oligarchs, and build our own army. So in a way, nationalizing or decommodifying the security of the state would allow for freedom of the republic for real, and not to have formally the political power for the people, and informally and in the background, the power of money, right, running the show in the shadows. And here I want to highlight a former postdoc of Lawrence, Jérémy Barthas, who actually works on this in debt and mercenary armies. Thomas Jefferson, at the beginning, at the origin of the US Constitution, he warned that debt is a way of enslaving future generations, because it's this government who allows for debt to be contracted at 20 or 30 years. Right? So even if this government will get ousted, the new generations will be forced to pay the debt that was incurred by former generations. So for him, allowing the state to get in debt with other state or other groups was a transgression of freedom, was a way of enslaving the country to the powerful few that run the show in the shadows. And this is kind of like completely reversed of what we live today. Today, the US government, the US as the most powerful country on earth, the richest country on earth, is going into the $1 trillion debt only because they are putting more money into the financial military complex, going into wars, sending tanks, having all the military bases. So today, the US spends more money in their military than in their healthcare system, or in any basic services, or any pandemic related subsidies for the people. And this debt is related to the vice of overspending, right? And overspending and consuming instead of trying to be thrifty and frugal and start thinking about sustainable development. And this problem of precarity, that brings debt, that today in our societies, if we think about our fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers, you say, well, today people can afford a car. So we have progressed, right? Today we can afford clothing, lots of them. There's lots of different ways to choose and different styles. We're all buying this on debt, credit cards. And in South America, 80% of the consumption of people is based on credit. So people spend 80% of their salaries paying back the debt that they incurred before. This is another form of slavery that we need to add to wage slavery. If you don't pay, if you don't work and you don't get your money at the end of the month, you cannot pay your debts. And if you don't pay your debts, the bank goes after your stuff, right? So you end up in the street. So you are forced to go to work even if the conditions are oppressive, because you have so much debt and your status of life with your children going to school and all the things that you need to afford are tied to that. So you're forced to do something and engage in activities that you wouldn't otherwise. So we need to think about debt as connected to slavery, reconnected to slavery. And the problem is not resolved simply as asking for more equality, as the socialist movement would do before, right? Before, during the World War II. We cannot ask for the whole planet to live as the middle classes live in Europe, for example, or the United States. We would need 6 planets to achieve this. So we cannot just ask for this first world or developed world status of life for everyone, because we will not survive it. So therefore, we need to change our ethics. If we're going to think about new societies from the plebeian perspective, from below, we need to really rethink our ethics. We need to engage different principles. We cannot buy into the oligarchic principles of competition and luxury and overspending and overshowing, right? And then we need to find new principles that can guide the construction of a new society. We cannot embrace economic growth. This cannot be the aim of our systems, because that is a failed path. A failed path that would lead us to ecocide, to the annihilation of our ecosystems and mass extinction. So how to think of a system that puts people first and profits way down, basically? We put people's over profit. How can we rethink the system to actually achieve this? And here, many of the challenges are, can we just really reform what we have and, make it better? And I would say this has been tried before. After the first engagements with socialism, democratic socialism argued not for overthrowing a system that it was clearly unjust and built an alternative society from the very beginning, from the very origins of representative democracy in Europe, but to actually adapt to the new system. So we have, for example, Bernstein in the early socialist Germany that believed that credit was actually a form of adaptation, embracing the idea that, well, we can actually bring more equality by allowing people to get in debt, because this is a way of adapting ourselves to the system. And this, he said, well, this is actually very good. We should actually not be dogmatic and not think about this as a bad thing, but actually as a means of adaptation. And here we are, right? So this has been thought before, and this basically failed path of embracing the freedom of the market and the vices of oligarchy have landed us in this problem of ecocide and mass extinction. So we cannot really rethink the system by embracing the normative principles that lead to accumulation by dispossession. I don't know if you're aware, David Harvey coined this concept that the system really, the gaining of some necessarily means the dispossession of others. So whoever becomes rich is actually have their hands tainted in blood, basically, or the sweat of others. So this is something that we cannot embrace if we're going to rethink the system. So we need to embrace a new set of principles, plebeian principles. And what do I mean by plebeian? The plebs were the commoners in the ancient Roman republics, and the commoners were just different from the nobles because they didn't have privilege. first of all. They were not individuals. They didn't even have a last name. If you were part of the plebs, you only went for your first name and that's it. You didn't have legacy, you don't have, you know, inheritance, you have nothing. The only people that are allowed to have this status are the nobles. So all the rest of society would be commoners. And these commoners had their own institution, an assembly in which they gathered and they passed resolutions, and they had their own representatives, the tribunes of the plebs, who would get these resolutions passed by the people and confront the nobles in order to make changes in the system. So it is this spirit that I think we need to recover, the spirit of the commoners, that are the most oppressed in society, the precarious, but not as a way of victims in a way that we need to save or help, but actually it's about empowerment, that the people need to empower themselves in order to emancipate. That emancipation is always self-emancipation. You cannot ask for a liberator, because that is to continue with the hierarchy that has led us to this point. So plebeian ethics is based on the separation between first and second class citizenship. People that have privilege just by the place that they were born, the race that they were born in, the skin that they were born in, the gender that they were born in, the religion that they were born in. This is privilege that is embodied, right? And we, even if we renounce that privilege, we just have it. Or if we are unprivileged, we are in that position. The only way to actually bypass the hierarchy is to become very rich and be part of the oligarchs, right? So we need to think about these new principles from below, and not trying to become oligarchs, not trying to, you know, become first world oppressors in a way, not trying to become the colonizer, trying to create an alternative society. So for this, we need to think about empowerment of the plebs, and also the aim of being anti-oligarchic. We cannot just create an alternative society that, you know, originates on the side. It is always in relation, in a dialectical relation with the society that we have. And the society that we have is oligarchic, is the principles and virtues of the few that had been passed to the many, and the many want to become the oppressor. So we need to think about these principles as anti-oligarchic principles. And here I want to highlight 4 principles that we need to take into account to think plebeian futures. First is solidarity. And this is a principle that is shared in a lot of grassroots activism, that is embodied and put into practice every day at the grassroots level. And this principle, very shortly, deals with the idea of sharing and supporting the other beyond reciprocity, beyond the quid pro quo, because we in this society are used to the giving and receiving, right? And receiving as a manner of debt. I did something for you, so you owe me. This is part of, you know, the ethics that we live in. Solidarity has nothing to do with that. I will do something for you, even if I know that you cannot or will not do anything for me. So this is support and care for the other beyond mere reciprocity, okay? And then we have recognition. If we are plebeians, we are second-class citizens in that we do not have privilege. Many of the most oppressed in society do not have equal recognition. The case, for example, of women or indigenous peoples is, I think, the perfect example. We need to afford equal dignity. We need to be able to value people for who they are. And for that, we need to give equal recognition, which is based on, I think, if we think about solidarity and all these things that are done in common, it needs to be related to equal speech. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And finally, yes, thank you. We have 2 more principles. One is not to be governed from above, but self-government, having autonomy to decide and to govern yourself. Not to be dependent on others as we are now. And finally, the other principle that I already referred to, frugality, or being thrifty, or we can think today, being sustainable. And this I relate to the management of the commons. So the right to the commons, the right to the oceans and the forests, and all the things that we cannot own, that we have no property over, that it belongs to everyone. This requires a specific management, the management of the commons that is based on necessity and frugality and the reproduction of life, that regeneration of life. If we are a community of fishermen, fisher people, we need to sustain the fisheries in order to preserve our way of life. So therefore, we cannot just deplete. We cannot allow for one to take all and then basically make that reef completely extinct of fish, right? So we need to make our way of organizing ourselves is related to nature. So I think plebeian ethics is really connected to the principles that are there to sustain nature, to the ecological way of life, in a way, in which there is balance in the ecosystems, that we need to leave the Anthropocene, the systems in which humans are at the center, and we need to move to a biocentric way of life in which humans are part of the ecosystem. And therefore, if the rest of the ecosystem is unbalanced, it means that we are too, and we can all thrive together. Finally, I want to refer, before going into the futures, to plebeian politics, because we don't live only of principles. The principles need to inform what the infrastructure that we are thinking of. So plebeian politics needs to be, as I said before, anti-oligarchic and emancipatory. So, for example, if we think about procedures, elections is a procedure for distinguishing, status, being selected. So therefore, elections is not a plebeian procedure. We should refrain from electing. We are all equal. We are all unprivileged. We have all different capacities, but that doesn't make us relatively better than others. So therefore, in order to create forms of management in politics, we should embrace sortition, which is lottery. That was the procedure, that was the preferred procedure in democratic Athens. So the idea is that nobody knows, nobody has a better political judgment, that you don't need to know any expertise. In order to be political, you don't need a specific technical expertise, and therefore we can all exercise our equal judgment. So if we're going to think about institutions, they cannot be led by one person. They need to be collective institutions in which we have sortition, we have people coming in that have the common sense and not the oligarchic technical sense, right? We bring a sense that has been lost. And also we can have rotation out of office in order to avoid corruption, individual corruption, right? So the ancient Athenians had this way of organizing in which they had this collective offices in which a third of the office would be rotated out, and newcomers will come in and learn from the people that have been there before them. So basically the people that have been there before, they would teach the newcomers, and this is the way of collective learning. So knowledge is not monopolized by leadership, it's not monopolized by the few who know, the people that if they get sick, like Candice here, who organized everything, if she gets sick, that the ship goes down. In a way, nobody knows that, we go all sink. We need to have a collective approach to power, because nobody's indispensable. Everybody needs to know how it works in order to make it work and not to be a failure in a way. And these collective institutions cannot be reproducing the same way that we have been thinking about in terms of political representation. We cannot just have one leader that just does whatever he or she wants. We need to have a short leash, on these leaders. So we need to think about representation as delegation, as something that, as someone the same as the tribunes of the plebs who would, fight for the resolutions that were passed in the assemblies, in the grassroots. Is the same way that we need to think about proper representation today. We cannot just give our representatives a blank check. This is what we do every 2, 4, 6 years. We just give them, I give you my vote and then you do whatever you want. And if I don't like you, I don't vote for you next time. But 4, 6 years have passed and all the corruption that has been accumulating, right? So we need to be able to make our own decisions and then give these decisions to our leaders, and these leaders need to show face vis-a-vis the oligarchs. And we need to keep them in what has been understood in the literature as an imperative mandate. So this is a hybrid form of representation. We cannot decide everything, right? We cannot just give all detailed instructions to our leaders, because leaders are in, a place of leadership in the capital or in the place in Congress or wherever, and they need to make decisions on the spot. However, when a decision has been made in the base, in the grassroots, in the district, then the leader must obey that imperative mandate. So they have freedom in everything else that the people have not spoken about, but they need to follow the instructions of the people when those instructions have been written down and approved. So with this, I finish with all these principles and ideas of mechanisms and procedures. I think if we're able to think about and imagine new institutions that will deliver a society in which at least inequality will be narrower, there's the utopia of egalitarianism, that we're all going to be equal. This is a utopia and a dystopia at the same time, right? Because someone needs to enforce that equality. And we don't want a moral police going around saying, you spent too much, you did this, right? We need freedom. We're used to this. We're modern, free people that are used to living in liberal democracies and have freedom of action, right? So we need to be able to have some inequality, but it needs to be relative. And it needs to be reset once in a while. So part of the plebeian thinkers, Republican thinkers, they said that basically inequality is inevitable in a place where liberty is allowed, right? Because we will take risks, we will work a little bit more and save a little bit more, we will buy things that others do not have, right? Other people will lose, what they have. So there will be inequality. So you need to reset it. You cannot allow that inequality to pass to generation, because then it increases, right? And our laws allow for inheritance laws, right? We allow for this reproduction of inequality and exponential inequality. So from the Republican perspective, we need a reset button. The same as we have our computers open with all these tabs, right? And we have been working and it's overload. And at some point, we need to shut it down and reset it and clean it up to start again, right? This is the same thing. Our systems, our political systems need a reboot. So we need to have an outsider institution, a common-based or a common sense-based institution that can judge every 7-10 years if the laws that are in place are actually helping us or hindering us, if they're producing inequality or they're helping, reduce inequality, because we don't have that judgment and we really need it because our laws are just reproducing the system of inequality. We need to go back to community-based politics. If we think about what is the first line of defense of nature, is always the community. The community is alerted immediately when there is oil spillage, when there is pollution, when there is land grabbing, when there is a water contamination. The community immediately knows. What happens today is the community goes to the bureaucrats and sends a letter, a demand, and they look into it 2 years later. After all, the damage is done, then may come and put some fees on the company that did that, right? And it's so cheap that the company will keep polluting, right? This is how it works now. We need to empower our communities to be able to stop the devastation of nature and the extraction right in that front line. We cannot keep thinking about politics at the national level. It needs to come from the ground up, and for that we need a network of community-based politics. We need to be connected because water theft and water pollution, for example, is not only a local problem, it's a global problem. Everywhere in the world this is happening. So the people throughout the world have to unite in a way in order to save, the world that we live in, the planet that we live in. Then we need to embrace this idea of, frugality, right? Sustainable development, as was been, development is already a kind of dirty word. We shouldn't be using it, but it's sustainable living. And here I want to put out the idea of regenerative agriculture. It's a movement of mimicking nature in order to make ecosystems thrive again. So not just planting any trees, but try to mimic diversity. When we were driving in the country, we saw a lot of timber industry, and we saw also a lot of native forests. The native forests are full of life. are full of diversity, full of birds, full of all kinds of insects, full of different types of grass. The timber industry is just all the same. It's a uniform logging of pines and eucalyptus or whatever. And in those forests is a dead zone. Nothing grows there. There's no animals, no insects, no nothing. It's quiet. It's just something that is really chilling. So we really need to move away from that and try to mimic nature in order for us to thrive as humans in a sustainable manner, in order to bring welfare and a good quality of life to all humans in the planet, but not the way the oligarchs do it, but the way that people from the ground up do it. And then finally, I want to highlight this, in addition to this network of assemblies, we need counterpower institutions. This is the final thing that I'm going to say. I have been working on human rights and the way that we can use law in order to realize human rights. And of course, from the examples of South Africa, but also Brazil and other transformative constitutional experiences, we see that human rights are not really realizable. Why? Because of mainly separation of powers. And this is a problem. When we think about democracy, we think about separation of powers as something that cannot be changed, as something sacred. If a leader goes against separation of powers or any policy goes against separation of powers, we immediately say, oh, tyranny, dictatorship, right? But the problem with rights that are socioeconomic, like housing, like healthcare, like education, right? Like water, like the provision of clean water. This needs money. Who is going to pay for it? So when it comes to human rights and any rights, it is the courts, the judges who are there to protect us. They are the new tribunes of the plebs, supposedly. They're there to protect us. However, they, because of separation of powers, do not have control over the budget, cannot trespass the line of the monopoly over the money that the executive has. So it's the executive power who, in the majority of countries around the world, has the power, the monopoly over the resources, the budget. So the judges cannot say, you need to find X amount of money and realize this right. That cannot be done. It's always done in a reasonable, what is amount the reasonable and the available resources. So if as a country we have a low tax rate and we have no budget to materialize rights, well, you know, my rights will remain formal and will not be able to actually provide housing for the people who are homeless. There are 2,700 encampments today in South Africa with no running water, no electricity. 17% of Johannesburg's population lives in informal housing with no running water, okay, no facilities. This is not only in South Africa, it's everywhere. And we are happy to live like this, like the idea that, oh, but 80% of the people have a house, so let's not worry about the most oppressed. So who is going to take care of them? It's not the judges, not the courts, right? So if we cannot trespass that, who is going to do it? Who is going to force the executive to spend the money in these public provisions? And the problem is that the short election cycles that are geared toward to avoid corruption, the idea we rotate, we have frequent elections in order to get rid of the bad apples, right? That allows for short-termism. Nobody, no leader is going to spend money that is going to only bear fruits 10 years down the line, because that is spending their capital and they need the capital now to be able to be re-elected. So therefore, all those long-term policies that are there to materialize rights are not being done. And there's no power to do an enforcement of those. So in general, those rights remain formal. So we need to think about new institutions that are detached from representative government. So they're not elected, they're not selected by them either, but need to be connected to the people, the common people. And the people that are in a desperate position, they are the ones who need to really assess what is oppressive and what is emancipatory. You cannot have judges that are part of the richest 10% really saying, oh, what is adequate housing? It's just shelter, just a roof over your head. Okay, you're done. You have your right to housing. And I want to finish with this experience from Chile. You recently had a constituent assembly, And with all its faults, well, it was not, the draft was not, was rejected because of other reasons. But one of the great triumphs of the social movements was the right to housing. There are hundreds of housing committees that are, the members of these committees are people that do not have proper housing. So they come together in order to fight for their rights, even if the Constitution does not have the right to housing. So this committee said, now is our opportunity to actually codify a right to housing that would allow us to fight this in court and force, the government to give us housing or makes us access to it. So they got together in a deliberative process to figure out and put some flesh into the formal right to housing, because the majority is like, you have the right to adequate housing, full stop. But what is adequate housing? So the people say, well, you need a place for privacy. You need a place where children can do their homeworks, for example. So you need a separate space. You cannot have this adequate housing, a one, single space for a family of 4. This is not correct. This is precarious. This should not be the minimum condition, even if the judge says it is a minimum condition, right? So it's the people themselves who need to define what the rights are and force them to be materialized. So we need to stop delegating this interpretation of our own rights to technical bodies that are bound by the Constitution and by the process and rule of law, and actually think about outside of the Constitution, outside of the constitutional box, and bring politics back in from a plebeian perspective that will not force or will not aim at having luxury condos for the people, right? Because this is unsustainable, but actually to create a new form of urban infrastructure that is more friendly, that is more egalitarian, gender friendly, right? And that would respect the sustainable life of the people on this earth. So thank you.
Many thanks, Camilla, for that really fascinating and barnstorming speech. So the floor is now open, but we have 2 floors, in a sense. We have the people here, and we have the people online. And it's understandable that there may be a slight hierarchy that sets in amongst the people here present. What I will do is manage that. And we have a roving mic as well. And you can just, I'll just select questions and you can just come and answer them. And for those online, if you could potentially ask your questions on the chat section, and at a certain point, I will, or Candice will read them out. Thanks very much. So do we have a question? Any questions on the floor here? Yeah.
Thank you for that presentation. It was quite insightful. So I just have one question. Thinking about representation as delegation. Oh, my name is Camila Vergara. I'm a former student of Hamilton. And yes, I just wanted to ask, what would be the determining factor to decide who the leaders would be in that kind of context? So looking for a leader for the plebs, by the plebs, what kind of criteria would you suggest they use so that they aren't in the vicious cycle of having a vanguard who represents them, but then still ends up receiving whatever they want to get out of it, and the plebs are left to try and fend for themselves?
Yeah, this is a great question. Thank you so much, Camo. So actually, I've been dealing with this because I've been collaborating with the Pirate Party in Chile. It's not a party, it's a movement. I don't know if you're aware of this, but this is the anti-party. They believe in a liquid democracy. They believe, it's very egalitarian. They're radically open. They believe in open source software and technology, right? So they are against enclosures of knowledge and private property in general, okay? So this movement came to me and say, okay, how do we organize ourselves to be effective in politics without becoming the same party that everybody, all the other parties? How can we not become an oligarchic party? How can we be not beholden to the leader that we're going to choose, and then this charismatic leadership and this almost this messianic kind of like relation with the people? So I've been working in the mechanisms of a horizontal party. So if we think about the system forces a leader upon us. One candidate needs to run. However, we don't need to abide by those rules 100%. I think when we think about plebeian leadership, we need to think about working groups. It's not a leader that we're electing or selecting to represent us. It's a group of people. And those groups of people need to be delegates from their own communities. So if we think about a working group in a municipality, if we're going to, for example, have a mayor running for office, we can actually create a list of, a working group that will be connected to the communities, and every organization could send a delegate. And those delegates can rotate, right? So we can come in and out. So the working group is always attached to the community, right? So of course they need to have some virtue in the sense of they need to abide by the rules. But I think that if you have imperative mandates, if you have resolutions at the local level, so one assembly says yes to something, and that resolution is passed to the next assembly, and the assembly says, we agree too, and then you have a sizable majority and said, okay, this is what we want, then that leader needs to, comply. There's no way of deviating, right? You select them for their features, for their character, only for the things that we haven't thought about, that we haven't, decided upon. And of course, we need to select a fighter, in the sense that this person cannot be, co-opted by, the environment. Because if we think about the oligarchic environment as the representative government and elections, we are going to put a foreign object in. We're going to plebeian kind of Trojan horse inside, and they need to be impermeable, right? So the only way to do that, we cannot rely on the character of the person. Everybody's corruptible, because the moment that you come into office, you receive a big check. And then you cannot have your children in the school next door because you get harassed or whatever. So you're going to put them in the private school, and then slowly you become part of them. And this is natural, only natural within the oligarchic system. It's very difficult to fight it. So you need to create mechanisms and procedures to allow for that working group and that leader to remain honest. If not, we're going to lose them, as we have lost the Vanguard Party. And one comment on the Vanguard Party, that the Marquis of Condorcet, who also another noble that was pro-democracy in the French Revolution, who actually wrote the 1793 Constitution, he because he was a noble, said, you cannot trust nobles and Congress and all the elites with the destiny of the people. The majority are corrupt, inept, or self-serving, and the few of us who are good people are always in the minority, so we never win. So there's no way of actually hacking the system in this way, to just put a couple of good people in and then wait for everything to change. We actually need to invade the system by creating this kind of Trojan horses that are armed with mechanisms that would make corruption and co-optation less likely in a way. And that is, I think, the way to do it: working groups instead of leadership. That would be my answer.
I think there was another question down there. Yeah, right away.
Thanks. Thanks very much. You come with like a more global outlook when you define about the permanent crisis of inequality. I can probably invite you to spend as well additional time and diagnose the South African inequality, which is technically, very technically, and intelligently racial, where you speak about the 10% and then the 80%, where in South Africa it happens to be a switch of the race that is supposed to be in control is the race that gets what we normally call just pockets like grants. So Black people in South Africa, they are willing to get grants to pass supermarkets and get grocery. And then on the 5th of every month, they get to be back in that state of permanent crisis. So I have been a capital market strategist for the past 11 years now, evaluating listed companies. So I think it is in different ways I have been interested to just get to listen to some of your inputs. But I just want to understand what can be the two interventions and mechanisms that we can use to redress the South African capital markets. That's to equal, not in a normal basis, because at a particular state, I remember when Soweto had a crisis of electricity 2014, I was part of the 3 analysts that when ESCOM CEO presents the financial results, he suggested that if ESCOM can recall that debt, because at the same way, it is a sign of inequality that is a thing. And then we looked at that up until that first debt be recorded. But if you look at that, Soweto is a township, which is supposed to be pretty much closer to the urban. How aggressive can be such a situation in rural communities? You understand? If the township is struggling to that level, how aggressive is that poverty and inequality? So it can be maybe an inequality that people can go 45 days without food. When 3 people are having, when 3 white people are having money, I just feel that, you know, when you speak about the virtues, I like the virtues of Aristotle as well so much, but I engage whites so much, but I feel there is a challenge in understanding the virtues in a local market in South Africa. I would probably contextualize as to say, in a way that we can try by all means to engage them. There is no level of understanding sustainability, shared growth, stakeholder capitalism, and human rights herself, because I feel the poverty in South Africa pushes people to think about human rights. And if then we talk about it as poverty, we have been studied. So I can probably ask those 2 interventions and mechanisms that can use locally. And at the same time, if you would like, you can ponder much. And then you look at the 400 listed companies that we have in the TS. And then you will understand that all that 99% are white, and black companies are small businesses.
Thank you. Yes, I think, first of all, one thing that I would need to highlight, that of course, this is a system that the same as the more ancient servitude system that we had in the 1860s all around the world, in which we had aristocracy. So we had groups that had legal privilege, right? We had slavery codes. So the rule of law allowed for all these kind of laws in order to treat your slave, right? We have all these things that when we think about the rule of law, we think about freedom in a way. This is what the narrative, right? And the rule of law is what allows for these financial companies, capital market companies, the big companies, to go on in this way. They're protected, right? They are secure. It's the state that allows for the security of those companies. And who is running the state in the last 30 years in South Africa? It's not white people, right? It has been the same communities that have become elitist, oligarchic, the vanguard party, or whatever you want to call them. And they are the stewards of the system. And there has not been real change between the apartheid and today, in a way, if we think about the inequality. For example, the land redistribution in South Africa. 72% of the land today is owned by white people who are less than 9% of the country. That has before during the previous, pre-democracy years, it was, next to 80%. There has been a little bit of an improvement. However, after 3 decades of a public program from redistributing land in the rural areas, only 10% of land have been exchanged, which is almost nothing in 3 decades. So, and it's not accelerating, right? It's just plateauing, right? So we're not going anywhere. So we need to think of beyond color in a way of who are the stewards of the system. The system keeps running itself. It reproduces itself. It's the easiest thing that we can do is just sit there and administrate the inequality, right? And we need to move away from that. I think, and with Machiavelli and other thinkers, that we cannot attack full on, the oligarchic power. We have the case of Salvador Allende in Chile, the first, socialist Marxist president that wanted to actually take on the transnationals. And he lasted less than 3 years in government before the CIA orchestrated a coup and killed him, right? So we have seen in the ancient Roman Republic, the Gracchi brothers, the famous that wanted to redistribute land because the majority of the peasants didn't have any land. They were killed in the streets, murdered in the streets. They were the tribunes. So all these representatives have been ousted or killed or, put in jail. We have many places in Latin America as examples. So we cannot do that. And also we're too weak. How can we stand to the oligarchic power that today is transnational, right? So I think the only way to really change the system is a long game. First of all, it's about narrative and pedagogy. So we cannot really combat the financial capital if we don't denormalize their own narrative. Today, we think about inequality as just a number. We think about the concentration of wealth and industry and whatever all the other indicators as just indicators that we attach no normativity to it. We don't think inequality is bad in themselves, at least in the literature, or maybe we as common citizens, we think inequality is bad, but it's not something that is portrayed by the experts as something bad. So we need to repoliticize inequality and point at it as something that is against human rights. And this is something that is the literature on corruption also attacks, that the moment that you have a lot of inequality, you have more corruption because you have less access to the services, and therefore you have violation of human rights at a structural level. You just do not grant those rights. So we need to contrast, we need to go against that narrative. We need to construct our own narrative, and that is done only through popular pedagogy. We cannot train our youth to be another cogs in the machine. We need to create our own, way of thinking and teaching ourselves about reality, because what is shown in TV is actually not what is actually happening on the ground. We know what is happening, we're just not sharing information. And that is something that happened in Chile too. Chile was the first country where neoliberal policies were applied, and it was the poster child of neoliberalism growing a lot, and all that growth was accumulated at the top. So there's a need to go against, that narrative of, Chile as the oasis of stability within, a very troublesome South American, landscape, right? In 2019, the uprising made Chile burn. We thought, and the headlines were, the oasis is burning, right? Why? Why did it happen? And of course, it's something that has been brewing for a long while. So people were very atomized, detached. They didn't share information. They only were fed information from above, as we are. And the moment of the uprising, when they thought that the media could not tell them what is happening, they went out on the street and they gathered in the public squares in every town in the country. And people for the first time started crossing information, and they understood that their own precarity was not they were not guilty of their precarity. Precarity was structural. So all the bad things that happened, that they couldn't pay the loan, that they got, dismissed from work, that, they got into debt because of a medical issue or whatever, it was everywhere. It was not just an individual problem, it was a structural problem. So we need to have this cognitive liberation in a way through knowledge that is produced from the ground up and not from above. It's not an expert knowledge that we need. We need the actual material conditions experience that can be gathered from below. And then we cannot just go against the society that is constructed, but we need to build first the society that we want to establish. So Hannah Arendt, the philosopher, talked about the assemblies and the councils where people meet to do politics as islands of freedom in a sea of administration and capitalism, basically. So we need to think about the new institutions based on these plebeian principles as islands in this, sea of consumption and overproduction. And again, I'm going to bring an example of Chile because it's this thing that I know more. The topic that I know more. With the pandemic and then with the recession that we're living, with the high prices and inflation, people are going hungry. And this is everywhere the same, right? So the same as in the 1980s with the crisis of the debt that happened in Latin America, women started to gather because they were hungry and the children were hungry. They started gathering to pool resources together and feed the community. So the common pots or the collective diners were brought to life. And basically women got together, they pooled, the one had a packet of rice, the other had some oil, whatever, and they would cook lunch and dinner for the community for free. And those spaces were the spaces of communitary politics in a way. We need to build from that very kind of central and primal, a community-based space out. We need to politicize those places that are already happening in a way. One of the experiences that I want to share, I worked with a very militant community in one of the rural areas of the capital, Santiago. And they have their own community, they had their own, common pot, they already fed the community, but they were few people and they were putting a lot of work. So few women were doing all the work, then the community was coming to feed and then they go. So it was also kind of like not building anything new. So they decided they needed those same people not only to come to nurture their body, but also to nurture their spirit and their political beings, because of Aristotle would say we are political animals, right? We thrive and we actualize our beings by being political. And what is to be political is to discuss the ways, the rules and the way we organize ourselves. This is what is politics. How do we organize our life in common? So in order to just not feed the body, but also the mind, they decided to put some money together, buy an oven, and they created a solidarity bakery. So in addition to giving food every Saturday, they would bake bread and they would bring it to the public square. So they would give the bread, for free, 1 piece per person, and the community all around started going, because inflation is so high that is the only way to have actual bread and be able to afford it is to go to the solidarity bakery. So then after that, they would have, with the hot bread in hand, they would have their meeting of politics, of how are we going to organize ourselves in this community that is underfunded, that nobody cares, that the politicians are corrupt. And from that, they started building community. So I think this is where we need to start. We need to start from material conditions, our life experiences, from nurturing the most basic thing, which is food. And from that, we need to make politics. Nobody is able to do politics in an empty stomach. We need to first do that. And also, we need to make it more egalitarian in terms of gender. Because the majority of politics throughout history has been done by men. The vanguards, the guerrilla fighters are always, all 80% of them at least, men, right? And this is a problem because the revolution will be feminist or will not be a revolution. This is where we are now. Women are the most oppressed in all groups, right? So it's the most oppressed who will create and make the revolution. So we need to think about childcare in these spaces. So women get together not only to cook, but also to take care of the young. So we have a community space in which the body is nurtured, the caring and the reproduction of society takes place, And it's not the burden of a single person, but of the community. So we go back to kind of basics in terms of building the community from the most basic human rights, in a way of nurturing, feeding, and taking care of the reproduction of our society, and liberating women in this way, and not just attached. And this is something experience of as a single mom. When the pandemic hit and we are alone, we end up, and we are isolated, we end up cooking and cleaning nonstop all day, right? And for me, it's like, this is the most terrible way of life. The bourgeois life is the most terrible way of life. If we had a community kitchen, I could be cooking and cleaning maybe once a week, not every day, 4 times a day, because we would rely on each other, right? So a lot of this task of the domestic duties need to be shared. And not only because it is a burden, it's because it's also a skill, right? With nurturing, we are more autonomous, right? We cannot just, if we, the same as we unburden people from politics, we make them inept. They cannot do politics afterwards. The same as we try to do everything for the young, and the young people do not know anything how to do themselves. They are less autonomous. They're dependent on others. We need to build independent human beings, right? Who are able to engage in solidarity and not just be waiting for a helping hand, right? So I think it's from this basis that we need to build up, and not just confront the big power. We need to first figure out what is going to be the germ of the new society, and how are the rules within those spaces in order to reproduce equality and not inequality. So election cannot be there, right? Again, collective work, equal recognition of speech, of hearing others, of valuing ourselves and valuing others, because we're all equal, right? This is something that we put in practice in those spaces, and we can from there build out. It's a long answer for us.
Many thanks, Camilla. Can you hear me? So we now have these 2 questions on the floor and 2 online. So I'm going to suggest, Camilla, maybe that I read out the 2 questions online. We take those, and then, if that's okay, and then we go back to the floor. Is that okay? So the first is from Michael or Elena. It came in 2 versions. Thanks very much for the fantastic talk. Some of the concepts you mentioned, overcoming hierarchies through self-emancipation, grassroots modes of organizations, even some plebeian values, solidarity, collective learning, biocentrism, bring anarchism to mind. Have you considered anarchism as a potential anti-oligarchic moral and political alternative to representative democracy? If so, what are its strengths and weaknesses? And then from Lawrence Piper, thanks for the interesting talk. Given where we are with global capital having secured its particular interests apart from the national state, can we have plebeian democracy in one country?
That's a very interesting question. Okay, so first of all, thank you for your engagement. And of course, anarchism is one of the ideologies that has informed many of the mutual aid projects all around the world. So anarchism was born at the same time as socialism and Marxism were all kind of born at the same time as critical ideologies that would question the status quo, the current state of affairs. However, anarchism comes with lack of norm or outside the norm or no norms. There are a lot of definitions of the word anarchism, but without hierarchy and control. The idea that we can have an organization that is not controlling and is not oppressive. Because we, in our minds, because we have been establishing systems of rule that are hierarchical, we equate systems of rule or political systems as oppressive. So anarchism has developed its ideology against the state and against the political system as itself, because it is oppressive, intrinsically oppressive. It cannot be made non-oppressive. Moreover, Mikhail Bakunin, one of the fathers of anarchism, would say that you cannot really wield the power of the state without becoming a tool of the state. The state changes you. So we can think about the position of power, of having people to boss around, changing your own nature as a human being. Right? You get used very fast at kind of bossing people around, right? So this is part of this. The position of power changes you and detaches you from the base. So this is what anarchism is so against, participating in the system of politics. However, I am very influenced by a very influential anarchist, but also very demonized anarchist, Rosa Luxemburg. And Rosa Luxemburg thought it was a realist anarchist, I would say. And she put forward what I have been deeming the dual strategy. So you are an anarchist at the moment of organizing the people, because the people need to find a way of organizing that is not hierarchical, that is not controlling, and it's not oppressive, that is egalitarian, that gives everybody, you know, a choice and a position. But on the other hand, we cannot just leave, you know, the oligarchic system to their own devices, because the oligarchic system, as any kind of biological system, will phagocytate any kind of, will eat any new project. And all the projects of the anarchists that were about mutual aid, about escaping the market, have all been swallowed, except for a few exceptions, right? So therefore, you cannot just, you know, try to live outside of the system and expect for that to be the new society, because the oligarchic society is so strong that it will not allow you to flourish. So therefore, the dual strategy is to have an organization from below, based on councils where everybody's equal, based on mutual aid and solidarity, but have an armed party in a way, an instrumental party, in which we would have these leaders or these working groups who will be delegates and will be attached, legally speaking, in a way, at least formally speaking, to the communities, and they will obey the community and not mobilize the community from the ground up, from the top down. What it happens now, right? You are a partisan, you vote for a party. It's almost like you are a football fan, right? You don't think, you don't change parties, you just vote. You're called by your leader, you mobilize. So the leaders use the people instead of the leaders obeying the people. So we need to kind of think, invert this relation and make the representatives obey. So you need to create a structure, a political party that would be instrumental in waging, you know, this fight from within, while and to, in a way, protect this new forms of life, of political life, from being eaten, right, by the system, right? So I am all in favor of anarchism as an ideology, but it needs to be realist in the sense that we need to engage with the system also and try to figure out the relation in order not to be contaminated by oligarchy, always trying to push back against this way of hierarchy of thinking. So one of the ways I have resolved it is looking at nature, how nature organizes itself, how organisms are structured. So our systems of politics have been organized as animals with a command structure, like the brain, that commands movement, and all our limbs move, right? So if we, you know, if the brain says something, the limbs move, or we move to some place, right? There's always a headquarters, if you will, a central power making the decisions. However, plants are completely decentralized. All the kind of neural endings of plants, the roots, the leaves, are all centers. So in every root and in every leaf, there is a neuron or a brain, a little brain in a way. And the trees, for example, have no central command. So the tree is not saying, hey, root, go there and find some water. Actually, the roots spread out, and all the roots make their own decisions in where to find water. And the moment that water is found, the root delivers a message to the rest of the plant so that other roots can actually redirect and go to the water. They even communicate with other species through the mycelium, which is a layer of fungi that is all around the earth, and they use it as a grid. And there's no central command structure. So I think while our governments and our states are structured animal-like, with one headquarters and you know, everything obeying a hierarchy, we the people need to be organized as plants, with every council or every organization or every assembly as being a brain in its own, independent, bringing signals into the grid, and everybody feeding from the knowledge that is collectively created from the ground up. And of course, the strength of anarchism in general is that it is based on a different set of principles: mutual aid, solidarity. Things are so foreign to us today. There's no competition. There is complementarity in a way. There's collaboration. So how can we switch the principles? We need to switch them not just by declaring them formally, to just put in the constitution, we declare our principles to be a solidarity republic, right? This is not going to amount for much. We actually need to put them in practice. So this idea that the principles that are plebeian, that are collective, they need to be acted out. They cannot be just some formal principles. We need to actually create and engage in praxis, where the theory becomes practice and we actually embody the kind of ideology. And to answer Lawrence's question, in terms of how can we think about this, infrastructures or this plebeian republic, can we think about it in national terms? And of course, nothing can be done today in a national way. We cannot, close our doors in a way to an interconnected globe. And not only because it is not feasible, it is also because the plebeian struggle for emancipation and against extractivism and against oligarchy and against pollution and all this, the burning of the fossil fuels, everything is global. It's happening everywhere. We cannot have an isolated fight. And I'm just going to give one example of one of the field work with indigenous communities in Mexico, in Puebla. So they had a French company come to their land to get all the water to be bottled and to be shipped to Europe. So basically spring water from, Mexico, the very excellent water. And the company says, oh, don't worry, we're not going to affect, the water of the community. And that's what they allow them to buy the land, and bottle the water. And of course, immediately, all the crops of the indigenous communities, it started to dry up. All the wells started to dry up. And in a couple of years, the whole community of indigenous peoples that lived there starting to move. And they were going hungry because they had no water, a place that was water rich. So they decided to shut the company down. And for doing that, they went the legal way, and they went town to town asking for people to sign, a petition in order to put this in a local ballot in order to shut down the company. And they did this tremendous organizing for months, and they got the majority of people all around the town and in the towns that were around to agree to this. Of course, the government didn't care about this, right? They didn't care about how many people have signed. They had actually like a mock a referendum. They did the thing, they put the ballots, they did everything by the book, and still they didn't have the support of the municipality. So they decided to take over the company. So one day they just occupied it, and the whole community just occupied the place, shut it down, and renamed it La Casa de los Pueblos, the house of the people. And they created a community center there, and it was a pedagogy center, and of course it was a resistance for this type of extractivist endeavor. And they lasted for 1.5 years, and they were ousted finally by 50 military people that were sent by the state. And then you see that the military and the police are really the gatekeepers of the oligarchic class, right? Because you use publicly funded, military and police to intervene into a private matter between a company and people, right? And even though the company didn't open up again, they're still occupied by the military, and you pass through and it's all barbed wire and it's just really impressive in a very small place. The company has relocated. So they relocated, a few towns down the line. So basically, they detected another water-rich place, and they just moved their operations there. And this happens everywhere. So even if you have a big win for your own town, ousting them from there and having, more sustainable way of life, and you have your water back, you just kick the problem to another province. So you need to be connected. So those indigenous people say, we need to be connected. We need to share experiences of resistance. So in order to learn from each other, because nobody records this, this activism. There's also part of the problem of knowledge, that we are always recording what the state does or the leaders do, right? Our history books are full of the victories of the military, of the great leaders, but what happens with the people? There's no people's history. And even the old communities, their own communities, they don't record themselves. They don't produce any knowledge that can be passed around. So it gets lost. So part of it is to share that, that struggle and that resistance with other places. And those places, that resistance doesn't know any borders. Oligarchy is transnational, and therefore the plebeian struggle for emancipation needs to be transnational. Of course, you start in the local level. I wouldn't say in a national, in a country. You start in a locality. You start in these islands of freedom, and then you connect them, right? And this is where I think the struggle should go. How do we connect them? Do we use technology? Do we use presence? Do we use a combination? How can we not be co-opted or be insecure, you know, that the state is going to go and repress us, right? So all these things need to be taken into account when we build our own mycelium, our own grid for these communities that have engaged in resistance, to share their experiences, to alert of new forms of oppression, and to be able to respond accordingly.
So I've got, first, thank you for why I'm making this is that I have a lot of affinity with what you said. So some of these are comments that are also trying to clarify questions that I think about when I'm thinking about political organizing. So I particularly appreciated the kind of broad framing of the project, this kind of empowering of the plebeians at the same time as its embryo party, kind of constitute a project that retains a form of political antagonism against someone opposing our particular project. And so in your framing of that, there was often this kind of representation of this we, we should do this, and my own kind of thing said our. And so what I guess my question goes to is like, it's sort of an obvious answer and not obvious to me, is that who is the subject of this project and what are the strategies for the political constitution of the subject beyond these principles? You've already spoken to this somewhat in around kind of politics that's structured around everyday basic needs and kind of taking kind of grassroots questions as the basis of the constitution of, I think, we probably call them like these institutions of common sense, which would include kind of network assembly, I guess, like other political projects. But I'm also kind of interested in thinking about the constitution of this political subject is how these kind of projects scale up beyond the kind of local kitchen making thing. Mm-hmm. So, and I guess, in 2000, there was an attempt to kind of maybe do this, around something like the World Social Forum. But that in itself, established its own kind of framework for professionalization and kind of division. And I also kind of coming out of that's particularly in 2015, there was this moment of a kind of organic political assembly that was constituted in what is now called Sonnenschlange House. And it's called that party because this assembly constituted itself and renamed as Podium. And was for many people and very inspiring set of things that went on in there. But from a kind of more traditional democratic theorists like my colleague Darren, and he correctly kind of noted that within the assembly spaces, there were kind of new forms of exclusion that emerged, partly about where claims to speaking need to kind of make reference to an unquestionable and most severe oppression. And on the other side, these assemblies, and this is being, as someone who's kind of interested in popular forms of democracy and has worked in this kind of project, there's the other problem, what we often talk about is a kind of the pejorative sense of the word populism. So I think in the ancient world, they might call it flattery, the way kind of forms of flattery kind of work in the spaces of the assembly, you know. I know there are kind of all these kind of strategies that kind of came up about how you manage these meetings, but they sometimes require, you know, some important American guy to come in, you know, to a kind of workshop or, you know, the hand signals, you know what I mean, which, you know, that takes something away from the organic forms of political assembly. So I guess, you know, I was wondering, and maybe this is kind of imposed in our own kind of interest on whether in our principles, sort of attached to both the principle of recognition and the principle of solidarity, there should be a principle of the love of paresia or something, you know, that allows for a kind of particular modes of critique that are almost a value for their ability to step beyond the majority view. And I think that's important for not just the kind of, you know, the resetting at some point that needs to happen as a consequence of the re-emergence of equality, but also insofar as the collective subject constantly needs to reimagine itself and to recreate its very value. So I'm interested in those which are kind of some of your sense of what we do in these network assemblies, such that our practice is not just democratic, but an expanding democratic practice. That is also rethinking what the democratic forms are. And so, I mean, although I can think of some solutions to this in a kind of general sense, or in a kind of, I mean, I'd be interested if you have any kind of practical kind of anecdotes as well. And then finally, just a kind of sort of a pedantic point that came up. You know, when you're talking about that, there's this, you know, there's a tendency that goes back to political theory to begin, where our idea of freedom is tied to this idea of slavery. And then our definition of any political wrong, you know what I mean, is the association with that wrong with slavery. So you do that in your talk by the equivalence of death and slavery. And I wonder if there's a necessity to kind of maintain the kind of categorical coherence of slavery as a form of domination, as we kind of also mark out other forms of domination, rather than using almost in a mode that is managed, which is, I think, often works when you kind of talk about that slavery or late slavery and so on. I think maybe it's in South Africa at the moment, a lot of practices maybe that's okay.
Thank you.
The long list, maybe take that.
Yes, okay. So yeah, many different questions, very interesting, all of them. Thank you. So this is the challenge. Who is the subject and how do we constitute? And the problem with plebeian identity is that first it's class-based, right? It's not ethnic-based. It's very easy to actually have an ethnic identity. We belong to a tribe, to a racial group, you know, to a specific nation, right? And that comes with us. So when we think about plebeian identity, it's an identity that needs to be constructed because it's not natural. It's not something that we can see. We share material conditions and experiences, but that doesn't make us an identity or part of a class and basically act together. So from the theory of left populism with Ernesto Laclau, the subject, the plebeian subject and the subject, the common people in a way, comes into being at the moment of the event in political action. So it is a moment of in that conjunction, in a way. It is then that the people understand as equal, understand themselves as part of the community, and that identity is not permanent; it's fleeting, actually. The moment that we are the things that are bad in our community are fixed, then we go back to the private life. Why? Because, you know, this class-based identity is fragile, first of all, and we live in an oligarchic system that tends to overpower everything in a way. So solidarity is something that needs to be cultivated and needs to be actively cultivated. because the default is the oligarchic individual way of being. So therefore, immediately we will retreat and that identity will be lost. So this class-based identity can only be created and established in political action. So how can we sustain political action? This is the other problem, right? We cannot keep mobilizing. And this is something that pushed me away from the radical democracy theory, because basically the only way to sustain, this identity is with permanent revolution. And of course, permanent revolution sounds very utopian, that we are all in the streets and doing everything. And I always, as a mother, it's like, who is taking care of the children and the domestic life, right? Of course, the permanent revolution is done by the single men or by the men that are detached from their families and the people that have no dependents, who takes care of, their elderly folk or whatever. So we need to actually integrate all society into this permanent revolution. And the only way to do it is through institutions, so through spaces that are secure in a way and that are open to all, that do not go away. So even if the mobilization or the action is not permanent, the space is. So it is a spatial kind of politics. We need a space. If we don't have a community center or a place to meet, it's very difficult to actually have a plebeian identity that will be permanent, more beyond the event. And I am here with Hannah Arendt and the idea that deliberation and making decisions and speaking actually changes us, makes us political. Makes us move beyond the private citizen and become a political citizen, and actually an active citizens in a republic and not just mere consumers. And here I want to also to bring the experiences of the citizen assemblies around the world. You know that citizen assemblies have been, tried. One of the most famous ones in France recently, the Citizen Assembly for Climate, to bring recommendations to government, right? And there is a growing literature on the kind of ethnographic and investigation of what happens to the people that actually engage in these citizen assemblies. So basically what you do, you put yourself as a voluntary, or someone calls you, say, hey, do you want to participate in this citizen assembly? You're going to meet, 7 times, 3 hours at a time. You're going to be giving this information, then you're going to deliberate, and then you're going to draft together, whatever, make a decision. And he's like, sure, yes, I'm going to participate. And these people have no previous experience, have now participated in any organization, not even a book club. The people that are really pretty private citizens, completely neoliberal in this way, right? And when they engage in the process of the citizen assembly and the deliberation, all of them report that was a life-changing experience. Not only that after the citizen assembly has delivered and everybody made the decisions and they have these resolutions and they give it to government, they become depressed. All of them, there's like a following of these participants, and all of them say, now my life feels so empty, that I am back to just my cubicle basically and making a living and being private, and all this other aspect of me, of really engaging with our organization of life and having a stake and having a role of power in a way, a little bit of power to exercise, is taken away from me immediately. So now the people that are setting up citizen assemblies are trying to make them permanent, as a permanent feature that you can be reselected, not immediately maybe, but others another time. But the people are changed by the experience of deliberating and making decisions about the life in common, and not only about your life, right? You make decisions about your life choices, but not about the life in common. And this is a different aspect of life, metaphysically speaking, in a way. Our identity is changed when we engage in collective action in a way and decide for things by ourselves. So I think we need to think about this identity as being constructed in practice, in political action, a political action that takes place in a space and that has rules. One of the problems of political organizing is that many of the activists think of the activism as doing no wrong, right? That we can engage in assembly and we're all going to be fine, and the activists get together and they hear each other and we're all in it together and we're all volunteering and it's all good. They don't forget that we live in an oligarchic society and that we tend to reproduce the same patterns of hierarchy and oppression that are outside of that safe space. So many of the assemblies that I have encountered have very bad practices in terms of speech, for example, in terms of allowing for the inclusion of everyone. So I have been trying to integrate some of the practices I have learned in trade unionism and, the syndicalist movements and integrated into the assemblies with incredible visible change immediately. So one of the things that I've been recommending to the assemblies is to incorporate the progressive stack in order to speak. And this is something that I learned from Bernie Sanders and the union movement, in which you have an open debate about, for example, a specific problem. And you say, okay, we have allocated around 30 minutes of our meeting to speaking out and free opinions, right? So everybody that wants to speak, please raise your hand. So immediately the person that is mediating take all the names of the people that want to speak, and then that person makes a progressive stack, which means that the people that are more oppressed or do not speak or are new are bumped up, so they are the first to speak, and always the most oppressed speak first. So always the person that opens the debate is either a woman or an indigenous person or a person from a oppressed minority, right? And you then at the end, you allow the people that always speak, that would say the professional activists, to speak. Because if you allow the professional activists to open the discussion, all of the other people who are just, regular folk that came to the meeting for the first time maybe will be intimidated. I have nothing to say, you said it all, right? It's the same as in the classroom. Yeah, I do that in my own teaching. So when I ask a question, like a provocation for the class, I say, okay, what about this? And people raise their hands to speak. It is only kind of natural in our understanding to just point to the best student in the class, the majority of times a white male or a white female, and they will basically lay out, everything. And then you will have complete silence. Because of course, the person that has straight A's already said what is needed to be said, and there's nothing to add, right? But if you give the space to speak to a person that has never spoken before, a person that really is just middle of the road kind of person, then you cannot shut them up. Basically, everybody wants to speak because everybody say, oh, if this person has no status whatsoever, just a normal person spoke, then I can speak too, right? So when the assemblies in Chile asked me to go and kind of give advice, the first thing that I said, you need to apply the progressive stack, because if not, you're reproducing the same vices of the oligarchic system, that you give more speech time to the people that are always speaking, the elite of the speech, if you will, right? The activists. And then all the other people will be demobilized. So your assembly will be condemned to be small. So at the beginning, I would come, and of course, 80% of the people were men, were a few women, and they all spoke first. So when it came for questions, I say, well, when you're asking me a question, I'm going to apply the progressive stack. So please, the person taking the names, do this. So of course, all the women are present, raised their hand. They all spoke first. And at the end, the professionals spoke. Next time around, the next meeting, when they asked me to come again, they were double the numbers, and the women were running the show. So the landscape changed, and the activists were very happy about it, because it's like, at last, we're not the only ones with all the burden of the activism. It actually is the community is open to all. So I think we cannot idealize, organization from the ground up, because the grassroots tend to mimic and reproduce the same patterns that have been taught outside. We need to rethink it. And for that, we need to keep ourselves honest. And for that, we need to implement mechanisms that would disable oligarchy from within. So we cannot reproduce the same oligarchic trends within the assembly. So we need to embrace the mechanisms of the progressive stack, the sortition, and the rotation. So nobody's indispensable. Right? So you need to give people that have no previous experience and no power for them to understand how it works, and for teaching to everybody else. So the knowledge is collected and not monopolized by the few that run the show. This would be kind of like the way to do it, and be very conscious of being anti-oligarchic in all your practices. So not only plebeian in the sense of, okay, let's do this together, but actually being conscious that our practices do not reproduce the patterns from outside, the inequality. And in terms of, and this will bring, of course, diversity of voices, the critical, because if our principle is equal recognition, Then we understand that in that equal recognition from below, understanding that our oppressed groups, even within our group, then we will bump them up. And that would allow for the diversity of opinion. So not that everybody gets the same amount of minutes, right? It's who speaks first, because that will kind of frame the whole discussion. Who are the first to open up the debate and who are closing the debate, right? And in terms of populism, you have touched, as the other part of my work, which is the kind of manipulation of that word of populism. Populism historically, as a historian, I'm talking now, has populism was an anarchist ideology from the very beginning in Russia. Self-government, they were the ones sponsoring recall elections. The first movements in history in the 1890s to push for recall elections, to have, your representatives ousted, to nationalize railways, to have progressive taxation, to have colleges open to Black people and women, for example, to be inclusive. The first kind of feminist movements in the United States were the Populist Party, right? And that has been forgotten. Now, and of course in Latin America, we have trends of populism, of these left-wing leaders, left-wing in the sense that they appeal to the people as plebs, right? They say, I understand inequality, I'm going to try to redress it. But again, we go back to the leader, right? The leader and the party. And how we call it populist if they don't do things for the people. They, not because you are, self-ascribed as populist means that you are one, right? So what are the policies, what are the principles, again, of that movement? We need to rethink it. And only in the last 15 years, this concept that always was class-based, historically, became race-based. So now we have populism as a word that actually means far-right nationalistic politics, right? And we have all around, and it's all European and American in a way. But populism in the global South is always class-based, right? If not, we call it nationalism, right? We have different words for it. So I think we need to be careful with that word and not reproduce the conceptual colonialism, right? That comes from Western Europe to redefine a concept that was class-based and make it into an ethnic-based nationalist against immigrants kind of, ideology. And finally, well, the problem is slavery. I agree with you. That's why I frame it as dependence. Dependence is a form of slavery. You are not a complete slave all the time. You always have free time for yourself, even if you're bounded, right? There's no a stark separation between being completely free and completely a slave, right? There are shades. I think it is a continuum. And we need to think about the worst thing, not as slavery per se, but as dependence. And that dependence that you cannot escape, that you are not longer available. There's no longer paths available for you to escape that dependence. Like, wage slavery, as it's called, right? That you are in this dead circle that you cannot really escape. As the other person said, this permanent crisis of getting to the end of the month. You cannot really think and be political when you're in that situation. And in terms of, how to make these spaces permanent, we need to build an alternative, I would say, to the shopping mall. You as a family, every Saturday or Sunday, you say, okay, what do we do, kids? What do we do? Majority of middle-class people, let's go and spend our money in the shopping mall, right? Let's go for the entertainment, for the circus. We need to build something that is an alternative for that. So a place that is fun, that has food, that has childcare, that has entertainment, that has community, and also politics. I think we cannot think about just building political spaces. We will have no one coming, So we need to think about it in a more holistic manner.
Fantastic. We're running out of time. We have one last question. Thank you.
Okay, so a lot has been said and now we're run out of time. So I'm going to try narrow down. Thank you for really so much to think about. So my first question was very similar to what Lawrence Piper asked around whether we can have plebeian democracy state-based, given who's the elite when we start thinking globally, transnational questions. I think I'll just mention how, because I think you responded to it in terms of how we can think about that in terms of resistance. I think a bit less on the building, how we build a political system institution that responds to kind of the global dimension. And one other element I think that might be worth mentioning, there was a very economic-based analysis of rights and inequality. And something else we also try to get out of our liberal democracy, sometimes more successfully than others, is protections for groups that are vulnerable in other dimensions. So you start with the questions talking a lot more about identity based, but if you think, for example, about protections for LGBTQ community, for example, I'm not 100% clear whether recognition does enough work for us. And when we start to think globally, when we use language like bringing common sense, people's common sense knowledge into the world we have now has different common senses about certain kind of morality questions that are legislated by certain states. And it's not clear how the system could account for some of those protections we're also trying to get out of our political system. And then just the second point, corruption in South Africa is very much linked to the connections between politics and the public service. And you spoke a bit about working groups, about independent institutions. If we were to have time, or maybe afterwards, we can talk about, am I correct in assuming then it's really not really changing representative, the way we think about representative democracy, but the way we think about implementing public service arm of running the state seems to need to fundamentally change as well on the system. And I want you to hear more about that, but I'm not sure we have time, but maybe we could just touch.
Thank you. I think you touched on a very important thread here, which is how do we change this common sense that is today oligarchic? Because in a way, our common sense, but for us makes sense as what it should be done, is informed by an oligarchic system, by oligarchic knowledge, principles, right? We are surrounded by advertisement, by the media. All media is oligarchic, the majority of it, right? We are fed things that are reinforcing the patterns that we want to fight. So our common sense basically is grounded on that, and that is very dangerous. Because we see, for example, in the United States, the people that back Donald Trump as the white working class, they're also plebeians, right? But they are informed in a way that common sense is really pro-oligarchic at the end. It's not going to dismantle oligarchy. It's actually electing an oligarch to office, right? This is like the other way around. So we need to go back to how do we create knowledge and how we share knowledge. And I think we cannot, one way is having community media, right? And all these other things that are ongoing, very kind of struggling. But also knowledge is created in these assemblies and in the interconnection of assemblies by sharing the experiences of resistance and the material conditions of existence, right? And understanding that we live in a world very different as the world that is painted in the media and the TV and all the ads that we have, right? So in a way, we need to build a common sense that is grounded on material conditions of life's experiences, I would say. And this is a challenge, but it can only be done from the ground up and collectively. There's no teaching common sense. Common sense comes from the experience of each other with the world in a way. And there is where we come. And common sense is different depending on every locality, right? The common sense of the Pacific Islanders is very different from the common sense of, the Inuit, right, in the north of the world. And this is a reality. And recognition, in a way, of course, it's not doing a lot of work, but in a way, we need to understand that our way of organizing, of voting, for example, majority, all these common things that are common sense to us make no sense to indigenous communities. So this is the first thing that I encounter in my work, that I was talking about, every decision you need to vote and make it traceable, that everybody, vote is counted, and we are in the assembly and we make a decision. And then indigenous people say, well, we don't vote. We actually deliberate until we get to a consensus. And this is our way of being. So we cannot, as Western, come with our understanding, cookie cutter understanding of assembly and say, this is the only way to do it. Their common sense is very different from us because it's based on other ancestral cosmologies that we don't share, right? So we need to have a recognition of that, of different alternatives, and that's why the title is Plebeian Futures, not Plebeian Future. Is there many of them, and they need to be experimental, as democracy was experimental once upon a time, right? We need to experiment with different ways of organizing, and maybe have different, different examples that could be copied. But we cannot have one way of organizing. This is part of the equal recognition and the building of common sense, depending on the experience of climate change and exploitation in the different territories. And I think, so we need to break away from the oligarchic media in general. So turn off your TV in a way and start talking to each other, I would say. And it's the only way that we can free, or at least be more protected from fake news. And I want to give again the example of Chile. We had the most progressive, full rights, constitution ever written in the history of humankind. It actually created a regional democracy in which communal assemblies would have power in the municipality. This was, unheard of in a very concentrated country. This would have changed the landscape, really, would have given power to local communities for the first time, constitutional power. In addition to all the other, rights, we had a right for a system of care that would have liberated women from the domestic duties. Socialized care in a way that is unheard of in a neoliberal society, and people voted against it. Why? Because it was fed through the news that this constitution is going to be worse, that could be endanger the little thing that you have, right? And people could not read the 399 articles because people don't even have such a bad education that has been defunded and outsourced that they cannot even. First of all, it's difficult for any specialist to actually read a constitution correctly, right? So you cannot expect a regular person to go and read, a thick, piece of, legal document in a month and make a decision, right? It's all about what others teach you. So in the media was 24/7 fed that this was a bad constitution and they should vote against it. So people who regularly vote for the left and are anti-oligarchic vote against it because they thought it was a threat for their meager existences in a way, right? So it is incredible. And if you think it as a more isolated place, the Constitution gave special rights to inmates, to people that are incarcerated. They would give them for the first time the right to a lawyer and to kind of fight and to have better conditions inside the prison. It was a win-win for prison inmates. All of the people that voted in prison, except for one prison, voted against the Constitution. And the only place where the Constitution was approved was a prison where the voluntary people went in to teach the Constitution. And of course, it won there because, of course, you are going to get more rights. Why would I vote against it, right? So then you see that the inmates who only have the knowledge of the TV voted against it overwhelmingly. I'm talking about 80% against it. So a constitution that gave rights to people that do not have rights, that was voted against. So we need to actually go against this misinformation. And the only way to do it is to actually cross information among each other and question, have a critical stance from within. And for that, we need to have reliable information. So again, the archive. Where do we store this, lived experience and our experience of resistance? How can we divulge this? How can we spread it? How can we cross information? First, we need to store it. So we need a place, we need an archive. We need a place that you can, as a plebeian, you can go and see, oh, this is genuine, right? The community X said this and they had this struggle, I believe, in a way. There's videos of it, trying to create a digital space in which you can access and have reliable information that could rival the oligarchic information. I'm not saying that get rid of that, we cannot, but build something new that where people can draw some common sense that will be for the better of society. And I would not say that we need independent institutions. We need institutions dependent on the people, which is different. We have our liberal democracy system is based on independent institutions, neutral law, like neutral institutions, manned by experts, right? That will serve the majority or will serve the common good. This is just a false narrative. We need institutions that are reliant on the people, that are dependent on the people. So how do we do that? And I think here, the experience of the citizen assemblies, not for just making decisions, but for creating these neutral institutions, right? If you have an institution, for example, as the defender of the people, an ombudsman office that will collect the grievances of the people and basically initiate law, initiate policy, and help, redress all the oppression that is happening, you need that institution to be connected to the common sense, to the lived experience of the people. So it's not how you're going to do it in a way. So don't select one person, one leader. Make it a collective institution in which people are selected by lot, just regular people, right? And then you can come in and out. So you have an idea of the common sense by people sharing their experiences and then acting vis-a-vis the government. We cannot get rid of representative government. We can only include new players into the system. And those new players need to be connected, right, with power. And in that relation, they will change the system as a whole. You cannot integrate a foreign object into the system without changing the system in a way, because that foreign object will interact with the other powers. So that changes the system without confronting and going full on against the system. So I think it is kind of a sneaky way of bringing change. And how do you do it? Say the global aspect. I think you need to do it one township at a time. And here you need, as again, the islands of freedom. You need, and in terms of like the step by step, you need someone in a township, a candidate that will pledge to abide by the mandates of the people. And if that person is elected, that person could change the way politics is done in that township by allowing the communities to actually run things or to mandate, right, and to create a precedent. So when that person is, not elected again, that precedent will be permanent. So that township will be a more self-governing one. And you need to do it in many townships as possible. You cannot just do it at the national level. You need allies. And for that, you need to convince people to run in that platform. So we thought in Chile about having a platform, we're developing it, of a platform for communities that would, upload their decisions. So other communities that can take them, see and upload their results. And also to have a list of allies, of who are the ones who are willing to be delegates when the people have spoken. And therefore to keep them honest. And therefore you can change politics from the ground up by setting new precedents and new rules that are not really bound by the constitution or do not need the sanctioning of Congress or the higher power, but can actually be experimental at a city level. This is, I think, the way to go. And that it doesn't need any boundaries. You can have allies in many cities. And actually the most progressive politics now is at the township level, I would say.
I think we need to stop there, guys. Please join me in thanking very much Camila Vergara for a really fantastic talk. I've been hosting these public lectures since 2016, and I can say categorically that I've never been in a position where I haven't had to think of some kind of question or abuse my position as chair to ask a question. Because you had all of your audiences completely enraptured, and there were so many questions. Really fantastic. As you know well, because we've done lots of work together, I agree and disagree with a great deal of what you say, but I'm not going to waste anyone's time further around those sorts of points. But just to say that Critical South, which is a blog associated with my chair, is going to soon launch a podcast. And one of the podcasts, we can't say exactly when yet, but one of the podcasts will be myself and Camilla in conversation, basically around many of these points. So do look out for that. And next up on the 30th of March for this public lecture is Tsepo Matlingozi from Wits, so a local boy. Talking actually on quite related topics. But let's end off by thanking Camilla again for a fascinating speech and discussion.
Thank you.
There is food outside and drink, non-alcoholic drink.